Hi everyone, today's tutorial is alcohol ink on vellum. I'm using Canson's 55-pound vellum in a pad, and it's a sheet of 9 by 12 that I'm using. And it's been affixed to a Lazy Susan. I have my alcohol or alcoholic ink wash, which is isopropyl alcohol and a couple of drops of yellow by the Pinata brand. Doesn't really matter what color. You could use plain if you want. I like color because it adds to the color I'm going to be using. This one I'm going to be using a pink sherbet, a coral, and flamingo. Those are all Ranger inks. They're all pink tones, and I thought that they would look quite pretty. I'll also be incorporating some greens later, but we'll start first with the coral. And I'm just going to set down a few drops of the coral. Not really in any particular order, making a couple of them larger places. There I ran a few. Really needs to be random, although you can certainly control where the colors go if you want. They're not going to necessarily stay exactly where you place them, but for the most part, where you put them, they won't go too far unless you blow the ink far away. So as we're placing down the colors, and that one I believe was the flamingo. And then we have the pink sherbet, which is the very light one. I'll do that one after I've worked the first two colors a little bit, the coral and the flamingo. So I'm just using my craft tool to set the ink, dry it a bit in place. And it's just something I like to do. It's not necessary, but it just sort of shows me where everything is and gives me some placement on the page. And I have decided to go ahead and drop in a little bit of the pink sherbet. I should say a little bit. It's quite a light color, so I put in a fair bit, several drops. And I've kept them just a little bit separate than the other two. And ultimately I'll be using citrus, which is a Ranger ink, as well as Rainforest Green, which is a Pinata by Jacquard. And that'll be a bit later. So back I go to using my alcoholic wash, which is the isopropyl alcohol and a couple of drops of yellow. And I was saying earlier, you can use a little bit of color in that wash. You can use it plain. I like the color in the wash, especially if it complements the colors I'm using, because just the colors mixing gives different colors. The wash with a bit of yellow adds yet another hue, a little variation on the color, and all those variations on the colors, just from it moving around, mixing with other colors, and then mixing with that little bit of pigment ink in the wash that I'm using, just creates some real added interest, and I really like it. Again, it's a personal preference issue. If you want to use a plain alcohol wash, you can certainly do that. I've tried that as well, and in some cases it's just fine. For this particular technique and for what I'm attempting to do here, which is a floral, I'm just not entirely sure what type of flowers, but gee, what kind of flowers don't come in pink and variations on pink. So that's my point in using the yellow again, was just to add even more to the color tones as the yellow mixes with the reds that I've put down, and even that sherbet pink at the bottom. Pink sherbet or pink sorbet, depending on where you're from. But I think you know what I'm talking about. And so there I've put the alcoholic wash over that pink sorbet, which is a much lighter color. And you can see that pigment is coming to life, and the dryer is allowing the pigment to move around exactly where I aim it. I'm aiming it away from my face. That craft dryer is helping the alcohol to evaporate, and the evaporated alcohol molecules I would like to be as far away from me as possible. Not only do I aim that dryer away from my face and use the Lazy Susan to facilitate that easily, but I also have a hood fan over a stove quite right next to me in my studio, because my studio sits in a summer kitchen in the basement of our home. So I'm very fortunate for that. It allows me to do this type of work even though we have a bird in the house, and these types of fumes could be very dangerous to her if I did not have the proper ventilation. And in addition to the hood fan over the stove, there is a fan in the bathroom right next to my studio, and I often flip that on at the same time because both of those fans are exhausting the fumes to the outside. And that's a good thing. That's where they should be. If you can do this technique outside too, if you have a Florida room or a sunroom or something like that, or just a room that is really well ventilated. You can open some windows, or you can put on a really good exhaust fan type system that you can remove these fumes with. So I continue to add a fairly large dollops, I guess I'll call them, of that alcoholic ink mixture. And again, that's isopropyl alcohol. It's 91% or greater. I purchased mine at Walmart. It can probably be purchased at most any drugstore or pharmacy. I get it in a very large bottle because it's just more economical. It's entirely up to you, and you can decide what your usage level is, but you can also use a blending solution. I have two types. I have one by the Jacquard company, who puts out the Pinata inks, the ones you see with the white caps around my work area, and Ranger also puts out their own blending solution. So it's entirely up to you. I think both of them are pretty much the same composition. The difference between a blending solution and the isopropyl alcohol is that the blending solution has a fixative in it, and so it helps the ink behave a little bit differently than the isopropyl alcohol. I don't really have a favorite, except that in this particular type of technique, I'm trying to get as much flow of that ink pigment as I possibly can. And while the mixative will let me do that, it doesn't let me do it to the same extent as the isopropyl alcohol wash. And so that's why I'm using it for this particular technique. And as you can see, I've really moved the colors, although they're translucent, so you can see one on top of the other, almost like folds of two different colors of cloth. In fact, three different colors of cloth, because we now have three alcohol ink colors on this particular page. And as I blow the ink and dry it at the same time, I can move those dark lines back and forth over top of one another, and that's what it gives the effects of the folds or the smoke or whatever you want to call it, that's making that wispy folds and darks and lights, and the shadows and the lights that we really appreciate, and that gives us that dimension. So what I'm doing now, as I'm kind of eyeballing this particular piece in pretty bright light, so I can't see necessarily all of the details, but I get the gist that the inside is starting to look like petals, and that I might get some kind of a floral out of this, which is what I was hoping to do. And so I've brought in now the citrus, which is a Ranger ink, alcohol ink, and the rainforest green, which you'll see in a moment, white cap, and that's the darker one that I actually put on there, and that's a Pinata by Jacquard line. I really don't see any difference between the two ink lines. I, as you can see, have a mix of both. I plan to continue to do that as I collect different colors of ink. I'm not going to pay a whole lot of attention to the manufacturer because they both really have very high quality products. I like them both a lot. I did find, I've done another tutorial just using the Jacquard Pinata inks, and found that the that would be called the Colorful Cauldron, and they are, at least the ones that I used, the colors I used for that particular tutorial and that piece, were very pigmented, very dark. So I used a lot less of them, and with alcohol ink and any of these methods, typically less is more anyway, because the pigment's not going to go very far unless you push it right off the page. It's going to stay somewhere. So back to comparing the two, there really is, say, no comparison. And by that, I don't mean that one is better than the other. I just mean that there really is, they're both comparable. They're both excellent. They both put out really beautiful colors of inks. I quite like them. And you'll see just in looking at the pink sorbet color, which you can now see at the top of your screen and moving around to the right, it is a bit lighter, and I could probably use more of it. Not necessarily in this piece, but I could probably use more of it in any piece because it's just such a light color and there's not quite as much pigment in it. Where if you look at the reds, for example, they're leaving dark lines in several places, which is lovely because that represents shadow. But really what they are technically is where the ink pigments have deposited themselves. And so those are the areas when I'm trying to move color around, those are the areas I aim for with my alcoholic wash, which you saw me just deposit on top of one of the spots of citrus next to the rainforest green, and I want those two to blend. There's a little bit of brown coming in, and that can happen when two colors mix and when the red is brought in. It doesn't bother me a lot, particularly in florals, as I've mentioned in other tutorials. If you want, even in an abstract, if you want a sense of real flowers, you can certainly do them all in very clean colors without any browns at all, and have them look as though they literally just came to bud and they're perfectly young and beautiful. But when I look at flowers, especially ones that are growing in the wild, typically there are edges to the petals and to the leaves that are starting to brown a little bit. Not all of them, but it shows me that it's a real flower. It's a real plant. It just seems a bit more authentic to me, but this is an abstract, and so it's entirely up to you. I tend to move it around. As you see me working here is exactly how I work, whether there's a camera on me or not. And so what I'm really trying to do is kind of squint and visualize as I'm moving that Lazy Susan around to see what's showing itself in terms of an image, and where could I use more color or not? Where do I want to get rid of color? Where do I want to move color? And in this instance, as I pointed out earlier, the pinks were really coming together nicely. They've blended well. I've got some pretty nice petal looking shapes going on there. And it's not distinctly a flower, but I can certainly see the resemblance, and I do literally squint my eyes so that I get the gist of what's going on. And when I'm making a video, I have pretty strong lights on me, so I can't necessarily see the image really clearly. And what I'll often do is after I've worked it a bit and I feel like I'm getting close to the end, sometimes what I'll do is stand up and take a look at it from another vantage point. Sometimes I'll take pictures. In fact, that's the most common thing. I'll take a couple of pictures and play with the pictures a bit. I'll crop them so that I can really focus in on the image. I'll turn them around so that I can see the images from different perspectives. And it often that exercise often reveals what exactly the image is and how it needs to be sitting in order to be recognized for what I see it as. You just saw me blot off a little bit of ink, and that's where it was, where the two greens meet and a little bit of red got drawn in. It really started going an odd brown, and what I'm trying to do is to draw the greens. I don't really care which green or greens, but I want them to get drawn a little bit more around the edge and not have the flowers sitting just against white, that negative space. I won't mind if there's a little bit of negative space around the edges of this particular one, but I want the green to be surrounding those areas of pink, which are now showing themselves to look more and more like roses, and as time goes on and I get toward the end and then I take my picture, which you don't see me do on camera, I walk away, I crop the picture, I flip it over a couple of times, and instantly I see peonies. So that was the reason for the name, and there's a pair of them. It's quite obvious to me. It may not be to you, but that's how I do it. And so, again, I'm really just attempting to move the greens around as much as possible, add some interest. This is one of my favorite color combinations too. I try not to overdo it, but I really can't help myself. I'm not particularly a lover of pink. I don't have a lot of pink, for example, in my wardrobe or in my home, but when I see the pink and green combination, particularly that citrus, but I like the darker ones as well, it's a very pleasing combination to me. And it just screams garden and flowers and lovely smells of summer. So that's what I'm aiming for here, is just to give this image a little bit more contrast, pull in a little bit more green. I don't necessarily want to surround it, those flowers, exactly with a ring of green and the flowers in the middle, but I do want to add some, and there's a couple of places where I had removed brown, and there's still going to be some darker bits of the brown left, but I've just there dotted over a few extra dots of the citrus, which happens to be one of my favorite colors, and back I'll go to the wash so that I could just move around the edges and get that green nicely spread out so that there's a nice visual of the fauna next to the flora of these what I think look like peonies. And again, you might look at them and say they're roses. Almost every floral I've done, I've had friends and loved ones not argue in a difficult way, but they certainly do back and forth over what their interpretation is of what type of flower we happen to be looking at. And as I say to people, it is what you see. So everyone is right. In an abstract, it is entirely up to the beholder, as they say, the person who is looking at it, to decide what it looks like to them. And so I'm very pleased with that last little bit where I moved the greens together and was able to have it dry and sort of come to a point, if you will. It just is, again, reminiscent, a wave or a nod to a leaf. Not everything has to look exactly like a leaf, but it adds to the image when you've got a couple that resemble them in shape. And that one at the top, it's at the top right now, really does have a nice appearance to it. I like the way that the colors have blended. You'll also see that I'm holding the tool. I'm putting less and less of the wash on, but where I have the green next to the red, I actually hold that dryer straight up and down, perpendicular, where I want the two to stay separate. Because again, keeping in mind that the alcohol and the ink itself and that wash dry really fast, you can prevent them, unlike with watercolors, where they tend to just sort of do their own thing, period, end of story. When you've got a dryer and this forced air, you have a better chance of keeping those two areas of color a bit more separate. There's going to be some blending, but that really is not a bad thing. Most often you can see, in fact, it gets kind of dark as I'm working on this one, but it's going to create an amazing shadow. It's going to look like the edge of a leaf, and the lighter sort of citrus colored area has also picked up a little bit of darkness from the red. Not a bad thing. It just adds a whole lot of visual interest and makes it look like there are three-dimensional or two-dimensional, I guess, objects, leaves or stems or what have you. And I guess I decided that that dark green area wasn't as good as I said it was a couple seconds ago. There's quite an accumulation of pigment, green pigment, so that's why I'm moving it. You'll also notice that my corners are not taped down, so that can be a real plus, because I can access the corners, and it can be a negative as well, because if the corners start turning up a bit, as that one end is a bit, it stops the ink from, oops, it stops the ink from moving to the edge of the page, which is where I really want it in this case. I want it to be spread out a bit more. And if you leave it curled up, the ink is just going to pool. Perhaps where you don't want it. And I've decided I need a little bit more, my favorite color, citrus. And I believe that these are going to be the last passes with the inks. And I'm going to give it another couple of shots with the wash, just so I can really move some of that green around. For a minute there, I think, oh, perhaps I could stop and do it with the straw. Not really a good idea if you've dropped the wash in several places to pick up a straw, because by the time, and you'll see it here, by the time I finish one, and I don't even really get the ink blown the way I want it to, the other ones are pretty much dry. What I did do is what I was talking about earlier, and as I was able to blow some unwanted color right off the edge and pick it up with a paper towel. So you can do that, and alcohol ink is a wonderful thing. It dries, it looks like it's, I mean, really, it's dry, it's probably even waterproof. It's pretty tough stuff. But the instant that you put a high enough percentage of alcohol on it, like the isopropyl alcohol I have at 91%, it reactivates the ink. So it's something to be aware of. Not unlike some of the watercolored inks, or water-based rather, inks that we use and are reactivated if they get a bit wet with water, they will reactivate. So you just got to keep that in mind. Not as many chances of you having alcohol splash up on an image as there might be water or some kind of moisture. So there's not as much danger with these alcohol ink images in terms of there being damage to them at a later date, but you should be aware that they are not completely set, in the sense that, as I say, if you pour alcohol or sprayed alcohol, which I'm not an advocate of, by the way, I don't believe in putting isopropyl alcohol in a spray bottle, you're just really going to add that much more alcohol molecules to the air around you and make it easier to breathe. Not good. So and what I was saying was, unless alcohol touches these images after the fact, nothing is going to be moving the inks around at all. You could pour water all over this as soon as those inks are dry, which is in a couple of minutes, or even less, 30 seconds. And the water will just bead right off. So just a good thing to know. And again, what I did in this case was I initially held the dryer right there. I'm holding it in between initially those two colored areas so that I can separate the ink. I want the green to run one way and the red pinks to run another. And I think at this point it's done. It is. And again, thanks for joining me for this tutorial.